one of the things that are involved in arguments about science fiction and definitions of science fiction are these searches for origins, searches for perhaps its fathers, its father figures. And Herbert George Wells is arguably the dominant one of these father figures. So can anyone name any of H.G. Wells's very influential, sort of genre-shaping science fiction novels? No. No. He basically wrote a sequence of 6 novels that he called scientific romances, and each one kind of defined a particular sort of sub-genre of science fiction. We all have heard of it. War of the Worlds is one of the key ones. So War of the Worlds introduces the idea of alien invasion, and War of the Worlds is, like all of his work basically, a very political novel. Anyone knows what the sort of political content of War of the Worlds is? So it's the first alien invasion novel of films, a series of films, many films, and arguably all alien invasion films are sort of play of War of the Worlds. Does anyone know what the political theme of War of the Worlds might be? This idea of being invaded by this technologically superior aliens from Mars. So he writes it in 1897. Precisely. He takes the idea of imperialism and of colonialism generally. And the protagonist is not a muscle-bound hero who is at the center of events. The protagonist is just an ordinary guy. I think he's a writer, if I remember right. And he's living in Surrey. And it just so happens that the invasion, or at least from his perspective, the invasion actually begins in Surrey, where Wells happened to be living at the time. And the protagonist says very, very clearly, this is just what's happened in European history. This is the story of Europeans arriving elsewhere in the world and completely eradicating the populations that existed in those places and dominating them, simply through a slight advance in technology. And the specific example he gives is of Tasmania. He says this is basically European settlers arriving in Tasmania, wiping out the people who were there and sort of raping the land for its resources. So it's not hidden agenda, really, really explicit, but he can use this idea of technologically advanced aliens as a kind of metaphor for this sort of terrible, this terrible, unstoppable force of invasion. And there's another actual message in War of the Worlds. Does anyone know how the book, I'm always worried about spoilers, but does anyone know how the book ends? Because it doesn't end through a muscle-bound protagonist.
They died like a disease or something.
Yeah, they don't have bacteria on Mars, and so they come to Earth and they completely overlook this. So the other message there is about sort of hubris and technology. That we believe technology is progress and will save us, but even these super technologically advanced Martians are just wiped out by bacteria. They just overlooked it, they relied upon their technology, they didn't meet any resistance from humans, they didn't realize that technology is not going to save them. So at the heart of science fiction and the origins of science fiction, you have this idea of sort of politicized narratives and metaphors of the world and how to think about the world, but also not just a kind of celebration of technology as being great, but technology as being maybe not the thing. So there are other things that we need to think about. So other books that Wells wrote at the time, he started with A Time Machine, which is the first time we have a mechanical scientific form of time travel in European literature. It doesn't exist before this point. So he takes, again, the idea of technology as a means of transporting yourself through time. before Wells, okay, so Jules Verne. So you probably know some Jules Verne stories. Anyone name any Jules Verne novels?
I don't know the name.
Yeah, that's pretty good. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Yeah. So Verne and Wells, their lifetimes overlapped, and they were aware that their work was being compared to the other, and both were unhappy with it. And both said exactly the same thing about what differentiated their work. So Jules Verne, his stories were adventures. They were travel narratives. They were kind of celebrating colonialism and the kind of white European adventurer. And they were celebrating new and existent forms of technology. And they were trying to be as scientifically accurate about those things as they could be. So for Verne, the idea of a submarine was perfectly feasible. I mean, a little bit exaggerated, but generally feasible. For Verne, humans get to the moon by a giant cannon. Again, he doesn't think about gravity and turning into a pancake, but he thinks, yeah, this is generally how you can get to the moon by a projectile. Wells gets people to the moon with a form of material that doesn't exist, called carborite, a sort of lighter than gravity material. And Verne says, well, that's just ridiculous. Show me this metal. And of course, Wells's point is that you can't just show the metal doesn't exist. So the metal is the novum. The metal is what Subin would say doesn't actually exist in our world. But Wells was very clear. He said, you bring in one element, you don't create a fiction where anything is possible. For him, that wasn't the point of the scientific romance. You don't create a world where animals talk, where objects talk and walk around, where people have superpowers, where aliens exist, where you have time travel. You have one of those things. And you have one of those things in as normal and boring a world as possible. And then it makes that thing mean something. That was Wells's approach. Whereas Verne was much more about the kind of travel narrative. So, okay, with Wells and Verne, what can we say about the period in which they're writing? So Verne is much more sort of mid-19th century. Wells is writing at the end of the 19th century. I would argue that in many ways we're still living in the 19th century. That things changed in the 19th century in Europe and in North America and elsewhere, but this is a sort of, I guess, an Anglo-American centric form of literature. And what changed? What were the differences?
Industrial Revolution.
Okay, so the Industrial Revolution brings about a massive transformation of European society. What kind of things happened in the Industrial Revolution? What do we get?
Mass production.
Machinery.
Yeah, so we have machinery as part of everyday life.
Transport.
We have mass transport. So what kind of mass transport do we have?
Steam trains.
We have steam trains. Imagine how, if you wanted to get to Liverpool, it would take you days by agonizingly painful, uncomfortable horse carriage. That would probably also be quite expensive unless you went really kind of cheapest options. It would be hell. There were no motorway service stations. There were no proper roads. It would be awful. Imagine suddenly there's a steam train and you can get there in a couple of hours in luxury. Your notion of time and space is absolutely transformed. What else do we get? So think about something like Manchester and Liverpool. What happens to those places in the Industrial Revolution? What do they become? Does London? Yeah. Yeah, so London moves from, the city centre of London moves from being this tiny little square mile with lots of villages around it to becoming an urban, thriving centre that is constantly being built and rebuilt, that is then being connected to other thriving urban centres. And more and more people are moving to these thriving urban centres. And their lived experiences of this sort of built urban modernity, like crowds of large buildings, of steam trains, underground trains. So yeah, this is a sort of massive change. Now, Okay, can you think of something, a psychological impact of all of this? Think about that idea of something new. Can you think of a psychological impact that this has on the sort of average man or woman?
People are more open
Open to what?
to like new things, so they're not really afraid anymore.
Well, like, no, kind of, I'd say the opposite.
Yeah.
Like, new technology is quite scary, and stuff. Same with, it's kind of both. I think it's both.
It is exactly both.
Yeah.
You get optimism and openness, and you also get a lot of fear, anxiety, and dislike of these things. And often the same people are dealing with those things. So there are lots and lots of debates and fears and hopes about technology. Okay, let's say you were living in the 16th century. What's different about that to living in, let's say, you know, if you were living through the 19th century?
In your day, it's like, working in the 19th century where it's, electricity.
Mhm.
Your day didn't end with the, sundown. It's like,
Yeah, absolutely. Time is becoming standardized, and your work life is becoming standardized according to technological forms. Now, let's say you were born in, you lived a long life. It may be that when you were a child or a young person, that was not the case. But what you suddenly have is the idea that things will change around you. If you were living in Europe in the 16th century, you could be pretty sure that your life would be very similar to the life that your parents have had, that your grandparents have had, and that their grandparents have had. There may be some changes. There may be things like, the land that you farmed has been taken away by the landowner, and they're doing something different with it. You may find there's war or disease, that there are kind of catastrophes that take place. It's just day-to-day stuff. But fundamentally, the world that you live in is the same. Suddenly, with technology, with industrialization, with urbanization, the world that you live in is no longer stable. The world that you lived in 10 years ago is different from the world that you will live in 10 years' time. So we have the idea that newness, the very idea that these things are new, is a new concept in itself. The very idea that the world in which you live will change. So again, that brings about, as you said, openness and hopefulness. You think, some people could think, well, don't worry, the world will be better in 10 years' time, because there'll be more industrialization, more technology, more jobs, more stability. Or people might be saying, no, I'm scared of these things. It will be worse. I will have lost touch with the things that make us human. We'll have lost touch with nature through technology. That's a brand new concept for European society. It's like newness. And still, you look at rhetoric around sort of England and English history. Narratives and myths of continuity are still sort of played out. And again, that's something that's at tension with the idea that the world that you live in 10 years' time could be radically different. So that's something I think Wells is really playing on, the idea that these things are going to be new and going to be different and not going to be stable. And Verne as well, but Verne is sort of seeing them as optimistic and saying, just imagine in 10 years' time, you can have a Nautilus because it's technologically feasible. We have the technology to do this. Okay, another key figure in the sort of writing of histories of science fiction is this chap, Edgar Allan Poe, who, again, most of you will have heard of. But what is Poe generally associated with? Poetry, yeah. What kind of poetry? How do you sort of... Yeah, it's Gothic horror. That's what we generally think of as Poe. The other thing he's credited with inventing is the idea of the detective story as a sort of new urban form of literature. Particularly, he wrote Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter, two of his stories that seem to sort of start this genre, this form of writing where a detective solves a mystery. But yeah, we generally associate him with a very sort of overblown, emotionally wrought kind